June 6, 1944, 6:28 a.m., Utah Beach, Normandy. The first wave of Allied landing craft ground against the sand and stones of occupied France. Heavy iron ramps dropped into the cold surf with a metallic crash. 36 frightened American soldiers surged forward into waist-deep water. Bullets snapping overhead, the smell of diesel fuel and vomit mixing with salt air and gunpowder. Behind them, their boater flat-bottomed. Plywood-hulled vessel just 36 feet long reversed off the beach, turned in the surf, and headed back to the transport ships for another load. 3 minutes later, it would return with 36 more men, then 36 more, and 36 more after that. By day's end, these simple wooden boats would deliver 156,000 Allied soldiers to 5 beaches across Normandy. They would storm Omaha Beach, where German machine guns turned the surf red. They would land at Utah, where paratroopers were already fighting inland. They would deliver men, jeeps, ammunition, and supplies faster than the Germans could kill or destroy them. These were Higgins boats, and without them, D-Day would have been impossible. The invasion of Europe would have failed. The war might have been lost. At least, that's what General Dwight D. Eisenhower believed. Years after the war, in a 1964 interview, Ike said something that shocked historians. Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. A man who employed African Americans and women in the 1940s, when almost nobody did. A man who bought the entire 1939 Philippine mahogany crop on a hunch. A man who told the U.S. Navy to their faces that they didn't know one damn thing about small boats. Andrew Jackson Higgins was a self-taught entrepreneur, building small, fast, flat-bottomed boats for a very specific market. Oil drillers working in shallow marshlands, trappers navigating through vegetation-choked waterways. And though nobody said it out loud, bootleggers running whiskey through the bayou during Prohibition. The boats Higgins designed weren't pretty. They looked like floating cigar boxes, simple plywood hulls with a distinctive spoonbill. Bow that could run right up onto mudbanks or beaches, unload cargo, then reverse back into the water without getting stuck. The secret was in the hull design. A deep V-shaped bow that transitioned to a reverse curve amidships with a semi-tunnel protecting the propeller. This design pushed debris away from the boat and allowed it to operate in just 18 inches of water without damaging the propeller. Higgins called it the Eureka boat. He expected oil drillers and trappers to buy them by the dozens. They didn't. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and Higgins Industries nearly went bankrupt. By 1938, Andrew Higgins was a struggling boat builder in New Orleans with a warehouse full of unsold Eureka boats and a drinking problem that matched his temper. Then the Marine Corps came calling. In 1938, the U.S. Marine Corps was quietly preparing for a war nobody wanted to talk about. Japan was expanding across the Pacific. Germany was rearming in Europe, and the Marines had a problem. They didn't know how to land troops on a defended beach. Traditional naval doctrine required capturing a port with dock facilities to offload troops and equipment from large ships. But what if the enemy heavily defended all the ports? What if you needed to land on open beaches with no infrastructure? You'd need small boats that could carry troops from ships offshore to the beach, unload them quickly, and get off the beach before enemy fire destroyed them. The Navy had tried to design such boats. They all failed. They were too heavy, too slow, or they got stuck on the beach and couldn't extract themselves. Succeeding waves of boats would pile up behind the stuck ones, creating a traffic jam of sitting ducks for enemy gunners. A Marine officer named Victor Krulok had heard about Higgins' swamp boats. In 1938, he convinced his superiors to invite Higgins to demonstrate his Eureka boat for the Marine Corps. Higgins loaded one of his boats onto a truck, drove to a military base, and proceeded to show the assembled officers something they'd never seen before. He ran the boat at full speed, directly at the shore. Just as it seemed certain to crash, the spoonbill bow ran up onto the beach. The boat kept going, climbing halfway out of the water. Higgins cut the engine, walked to the bow, stepped onto dry land, then got back in the boat, threw the engine into reverse, and backed smoothly into the water. The whole process took maybe 30 seconds. The Marines were impressed. The Navy was skeptical. The boat was made of plywood. It had no armor. It looked crude. And most importantly, Andrew Higgins wasn't one of the established Navy contractors. He was a nobody from New Orleans who built boats for swamp trappers. The Navy told Higgins, "Thanks, but no thanks." They had their own design office, working on landing craft. They didn't need some Louisiana boat builder telling them how to build boats. Higgins went back to New Orleans, furious. Over the next 2 years, he would fight the Navy bureaucracy with the same stubborn determination that made him successful in business. He wrote letters. He demonstrated his boats repeatedly. He used political connections. He complained loudly to anyone who would listen that the Navy doesn't know one damn thing about small boats. Their own landing craft designs continued failing. By 1940, war was coming, and everyone knew it. The Navy's preferred landing craft design, a metal boat with a ramp at the rear, was proving disastrous in tests. Troops had to climb over the sides to exit, which was slow and made them vulnerable. The boats were heavy and slow. They got stuck on beaches. They were, in short, exactly what you didn't want in a landing craft. Some officers began pushing for Higgins' design. The political pressure built. Finally, in 1940, the Navy grudgingly agreed to give Higgins a contract to build a test batch of his boats. They called it the Landing Craft, Personnel Large, or LCVP. It was essentially Higgins' Eureka boat, slightly modified for military use. But the Marines still weren't satisfied. The LCPL was better than what the Navy had, but it still had a problem. Troops had to exit over the sides. What the Marines wanted was a ramp at the front, a bow ramp, that would drop down the instant the boat hit the beach, allowing troops to charge straight forward into combat. The Navy said this was impossible. The bow ramp would make the boat too heavy. It would affect the boat's performance. It couldn't be done. Higgins thought about it for approximately 10 minutes, took a hacksaw, cut the bow off one of his LCPL boats, welded on a steel ramp with hinges, and called the Marines to come look at it. The entire modification took him a day. The Marines loved it. The Navy was horrified. But the Marines outranked the Navy bureaucrats on this issue, and in 1942, Higgins received a contract to produce what would become famous as the LCVP landing craft, vehicle personnel. The Higgins boat, the final design was beautifully simple. 36 feet long, just under 11 feet wide, made primarily of plywood with a steel bow ramp, powered by a 225 horsepower diesel engine that could push the boat to 12 knots. Shallow draft of only 3 feet at the stern, 2 feet 2 inches at the bow. 2.30 caliber machine guns mounted at the rear for defensive fire. It could carry a 36-man infantry platoon with full combat equipment, or it could carry a jeep and 12 men, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. The bow ramp could drop in seconds. The boat could beach itself, unload, reverse off the sand, and be gone in 3 to 4 minutes. And most importantly, it was made of plywood. At a time when steel was desperately needed for ships, tanks, and aircraft, Higgins boats consumed almost no strategic materials. They were cheap to build, about $10,000 each, compared to hundreds of thousands for metal landing craft. And they could be built fast. Which brings us to the second part of Andrew Higgins' genius: manufacturing at scale. When the war started, in December 1941, Higgins Industries employed maybe 500 workers building boats in a small facility in New Orleans. By 1943, Higgins employed over 30,000 workers in 8 separate plants across the city. At peak production, his factories were completing over 700 boats per month. The workforce itself was revolutionary for 1940s America. Higgins hired African Americans and women in large numbers, paying them the same wages as white male workers and promoting based on skill rather than race or gender. In segregated Louisiana, this was almost unheard of. When asked why, Higgins supposedly said something like, "I don't care what color you are, or what's between your legs. Can you build boats? Then you're hired." Engines arrived from suppliers already tested. Ramps were welded in batches. Everything was designed for speed. The numbers Higgins achieved were staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, Higgins Industries and companies licensed to build Higgins design produced 23,358 LCVP landing craft. That's not counting the thousands of other craft. Higgins built larger landing craft, PT boats, supply vessels, and specialized designs. To put that in perspective, by 1944, Higgins boats accounted for 92% of the entire U.S. Navy's inventory of boats and ships. More than 90%. One company in New Orleans, run by a self-taught boat builder, was producing nearly every small craft in the U.S. Navy. And the boats worked. They worked spectacularly. The first major combat test came in August 1942 at Guadalcanal in the Pacific. Marines landed in Higgins boats under fire, established beachheads, and the boats kept coming back with more men and supplies. The Japanese couldn't stop them. The Marines secured the island. Then came North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch. Allied forces landed at multiple beaches across Morocco and Algeria, all delivered by Higgins boats. Some boats were destroyed by enemy fire. Most made it. The landings succeeded. Sicily in July 1943. Italy in September 1943. Tarawa in November 1943. Brutal, bloody battle where Higgins boats landed Marines directly into Japanese machine gun fire on a coral reef. The casualties were horrific, but the boats kept coming. The Marines won. By early 1944, Higgins boats had proven themselves in every theater of the war. They had landed troops under fire dozens of times. They had delivered supplies, evacuated wounded, supported amphibious operations across the Pacific and Mediterranean. Every Allied commander planning amphibious operations knew that Higgins boats made it possible. Which brings us back to June 6, 1944. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. Planning for Overlord, the code name for the Normandy invasion, required solving an impossible logistics problem. The Allies needed to land approximately 156,000 troops on 5 beaches across 50 miles of heavily fortified French coastline. There were no ports, no docks, no infrastructure, just beaches backed by cliffs and fortified German positions. The only way to do it was with landing craft, thousands of them, and the vast majority would be Higgins boats. On the morning of June 6, 1944, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 Higgins boats participated in the initial assault. They launched from transport ships 11 miles offshore. They formed up in choppy seas under grey skies. Then they headed for the beaches. At Omaha Beach, the boats delivered the 1st Infantry Division directly into the teeth of the most heavily defended sector. German machine guns, mortar and artillery turned the beach into a killing zone. Higgins boats were hit, sunk, destroyed. Men were cut down the instant the ramps dropped. It was carnage. But the boats kept coming, wave after wave. Every few minutes, more boats grinding onto the sand, ramps dropping, men charging forward. Some boats made 8 round trips that day. 8 times running into that hell. 8 times backing off and going for another load. At Utah Beach, the landings went better. The boats delivered men and equipment with fewer casualties. By noon, the beachhead was secure. The British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, Swordsaw, similar scenes. Higgins boats mixed with British landing craft, all delivering the overwhelming mass of men and material that would win the battle. By the end of D-Day, Higgins boats had delivered the majority of the 156,000 Allied troops who landed in Normandy. Over the following weeks, they would deliver hundreds of thousands more, along with jeeps, trucks, artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, and everything else an army needs. The Normandy invasion succeeded for many reasons: superior intelligence, massive air and naval support, tactical deception, and the courage of the soldiers. But without Higgins boats, it couldn't have happened at all. Without a way to land troops directly on open beaches, the Allies would have been forced to capture a French port first, which would have been vastly more difficult and costly. Eisenhower understood this. After the war, he visited the beaches and saw the wreckage of destroyed Higgins boats scattered across the sand. He realized that those simple plywood boats, designed by a stubborn boat builder from Louisiana, who the Navy had tried to ignore, had been absolutely essential to victory. The Pacific War told the same story. Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Okinawa in April 1945, Leyte in the Philippines, Guam, Saipan, every major amphibious operation used Higgins boats to deliver the first waves of Marines and Army troops. The boats would storm beaches under fire, unload, and keep coming back. Colonel Joseph Alexander, a Marine Corps historian, wrote years later, "The Higgins boats broke the gridlock on the ship-to-shore movement. It is impossible to overstate the tactical advantages this craft gave us amphibious commanders in World War II." Between 1942 and 1945, Higgins Industries in New Orleans produced more landing craft than the rest of the world combined. A single company, employing 30,000 workers, building boats from plywood, outproduced every shipyard in Japan, Germany, Italy, and Britain. The cost comparison is equally stunning. Each Higgins boat costs approximately $10,000 to build. The entire production run of 23,358 boats cost maybe $230 million. Compare that to a single battleship, which cost $100 million and took years to build. For the price of 2 battleships, America built enough landing craft to deliver armies to any beach in the world. And the boats lasted. They were designed as expendable craft with maybe a 1-year lifespan. Many served for the entire war and beyond. Some Higgins boats were still in military service in the 1960s. A few survive today as museum pieces, including one that still runs under its own power. Andrew Higgins himself became a national figure during the war. Newspapers called him a genius. The government awarded him the Army-Navy E Award, multiple times the highest honor that could be given to a defense contractor. His face appeared in magazines. He was profiled as an example of American entrepreneurial spirit. He also remained exactly who he'd always been, a hard-drinking, hot-tempered boat builder who said what he thought and didn't care whose feelings got hurt. He fought with Navy bureaucrats throughout the war. He complained about regulations. He pushed his workers hard, but paid them well and treated them fairly. He was, by all accounts, difficult, brilliant, and absolutely essential. After the war, Higgins Industries tried to transition to peacetime production. It didn't work. The company built some commercial boats, tried various ventures, and slowly declined. Higgins himself died in 1952, his fortune largely gone, his company a shadow of its wartime peak. For decades after, he was largely forgotten. Early histories of D-Day and the Pacific War focused on generals, admirals, and combat troops. The humble landing craft that made it all possible got maybe a footnote. Andrew Higgins, the man Eisenhower called the man who won the war for us, faded from public memory. It wasn't until the late 1990s that interest revived. Books like Jerry Strahan's Andrew Jackson, Higgins, and the Boats that won World War II told his story to a new generation. The movie Saving Private Ryan showed Higgins boats storming Omaha Beach, introducing millions to the craft. The National World War II Museum opened in New Orleans' Higgins' hometown, partially as a tribute to his contribution. Today, historians recognize Higgins boats as one of the most important pieces of military equipment in World War II. Not the most glamorous, not the most powerful, but absolutely essential. Without them, the Allied strategy of amphibious warfare would have been impossible. D-Day couldn't have happened. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific couldn't have happened. The entire course of the war would have been different. The lesson of Andrew Higgins and his boats goes beyond military history. It's a story about innovation coming from unexpected places. The Navy's own designers, with all their education and resources, couldn't solve the landing craft problem. The solution came from an outsider boat builder who understood swamps and bayous, who knew how to make boats that could go anywhere and do anything. It's a story about persistence. Higgins fought the Navy bureaucracy for years. He was rejected, dismissed, and told he didn't know what he was talking about. He kept pushing until someone listened. If he'd given up, if he'd accepted the Navy's rejection, the Allies might have lost the war. It's a story about American industrial capacity. One man with one company in one city employed 30,000 workers and outproduced the entire Japanese Navy. That's the power of American manufacturing at its peak, the ability to take a good design and produce it in quantities that seem impossible. And it's a story about simplicity. Higgins' boats weren't high-tech. They were plywood and steel and diesel engines. They were crude, ugly, uncomfortable, and they got the job done better than anything else because they were designed to solve a specific problem without worrying about elegance or sophistication. The legacy lives on. Modern amphibious warfare still uses variations of Higgins' basic design. Flat-bottomed landing craft, with bow ramps, capable of beaching themselves and retracting quickly. The principles he established in the 1940s remain valid today. More than 20,000 Higgins boats were built during World War II. Most were scrapped after the war. A few survive in museums, but their impact echoes through history. Every amphibious landing since 1942 has used lessons learned from Higgins' design. Every modern landing craft is, in some way, a descendant of that Louisiana swamp boat. When Eisenhower said Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us, he wasn't exaggerating. He was stating a simple truth that historians have confirmed over decades of study. Without Higgins' boats, the Allies couldn't have landed on defended beaches. Without the ability to land on defended beaches, the strategy for defeating Germany and Japan would have been fundamentally different and far more difficult. One boat builder from New Orleans, working with plywood and stubbornness, gave the Allies the weapon they needed most: the ability to deliver armies anywhere, anytime, regardless of whether there was a port or dock or infrastructure. He took his swamp boat design, modified it slightly, and handed the US military the key to victory. In the end, the story of Andrew Higgins and his boats is pure American. An outsider with a better idea fights the establishment, persists through rejection, scales up production to impossible levels, and helps win the war. It's innovation, manufacturing, and determination combined into one simple plywood boat that changed the course of human history. General Eisenhower got it right. Andrew Higgins really was the man who won the war for us, and he did it with a wooden boat designed to navigate Louisiana swamps, modified with a steel ramp, and built by 30,000 workers in New Orleans, who probably never fully understood how important their work was. 23,000 boats, plywood and steel. Simple, crude, effective. That's how you win a war. Not with the fanciest technology or the most sophisticated weapons, but with the right tool, built in overwhelming numbers. By people who believe in what they're doing. Higgins gave the Allies that tool. And on beaches from Normandy to Okinawa, in the face of bullets and artillery and death, those simple plywood boats delivered the men who won the war. That's the legacy of Andrew Jackson Higgins, the stubborn boat builder from New Orleans, who told the Navy they didn't know anything about small boats and proved it by building the boat that won World War II.